Everybody, we're going to get rolling. This is the Match Made in Heaven Livestock Plus Crops, Understanding the Economics of Integrated Crop and Livestock Systems. And I am Jane Jewett with the University of Minnesota. I was the lead on this project, which was under the umbrella of Greenland's Blue Waters, which is a multi-state research and education and outreach collective that is dedicated to continuous living cover in agriculture. And that includes a number of strategies, including agroforestry and perennial grains and cover crops. But this project was led by the Midwest Perennial Forage Working Group, which is all about livestock and forages. We like perennials, but we also deal with cover crops and silvopasture. So the funding for this project was from the North Central Extension Risk Management Education Program, underwritten by USDA. And here's our project team. So myself, Laura Payne, Wisconsin Grazing and Livestock Specialist, Jennifer Lutz from University of Missouri Extension, Gabby Bulwark from University of Minnesota Extension, Jason Cavadini from University of Wisconsin Extension, and Margaret Chamis from Practical Farmers of Iowa. And we are all here. So I'm going to hand this over to Gabby to start us off.
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm just going to talk real quickly about why we might do livestock integration or promote it as a practice. So when we look at it through the lens of the soil health principles, which we have here, the soil health principles are sort of a guideline that we can use for how we might manage our land to improve soil health. The 5 principles are keeping the ground covered or keeping the soil armored, we might say, minimizing soil disturbance, increasing plant diversity, keeping living roots in the ground year-round or as long as possible, and integrate livestock. So most farmers tend to focus on the first 4 of these soil health principles, but integrating livestock, the 5th principle, has a lot of high potential for impact. And when we integrate livestock, we are also sort of inadvertently also targeting the other 4. And this can lead to, maybe a more rapid or a more intense buildup of soil health. Next. And then when we use these soil health principles and integrate livestock in a well-managed way, we can end up helping to protect some farm resources, things like reducing soil erosion, which therefore protects water quality if we're keeping, sediment and chemicals and nutrients, things like that out of the water. By integrating livestock into, cropping systems or just farming systems as a whole, we can also increase the water holding capacity of our soil due to the extra organic matter that we are adding into the systems. Organic matter acts like a sponge, so it can hold water pretty well. And another benefit that you might see from integrating livestock is providing some wildlife and pollinator habitat on the landscape. Next. So with this project, what we were trying to look at is what the financial benefits might be of integration. So we were trying to test if there was a benefit to spreading the financial risk over multiple enterprises, so crops and livestock. Diversification is a risk management strategy that you can use, whether it's in, personal finances or other things. So we were trying to tease out if that's something that might be happening in integrated systems. And another thing that we are trying to look at is if there's a reduction in input costs, things such as fertilizer, ag chemicals, feed, things that might come about from the resource efficiency that we can see with crop and livestock integration. And next.
All right, so you might be wondering what exactly we mean by livestock integration. And I'm going to use a previous project to kind of explain and flesh out what that looks like. We The genesis of this project that's focused on financials was a broader project that looks at livestock integration across the upper Midwest. And one of the centerpieces of that project was a big survey that we did, asking farmers what sorts of practices they use, whether they're integrated or not. So the study was conducted in 2023. We had about 550 respondents from 25 states represented. As you can see here, they're kind of mid-career farmers on average, 49 years old with a couple of decades of farming experience. And the average for the farms in the survey was about 500 acres. Next slide. These pie charts show what we found in this pool of farmers that we surveyed. The vast majority of them had both livestock and crops. You can see 457 on the left. But their income distribution was somewhat different. As you can see on the right, about 2/3, maybe 2/3 of their income came from livestock, and another third or so from grain crops. So these were they were integrated systems, truly, where they were had a couple of enterprises that were significant sources of income. Okay, next slide. To get a sense of the kinds of practices these farmers are using, we asked a number of questions about what they were doing in terms of livestock integration. How are they integrating their crop and livestock enterprises on their farms? So as you can see here, the managed rotational grazing was a major part of their practice strategies. They also did a lot of crop residue grazing and grazing cover crops on cropland, bale grazing, which is winter feeding, outwintering on cropland and pasture. And they also incorporated a significant number of summer and winter annual crops into their crop rotations. The other thing I'd like to point out about this slide is that we asked them like when they adopted these practices, and the blue portions of each of these bars shows farmers that have been using these practices for quite a while, 5 or 10 or 20 years. The interesting thing, I think, is the proportion in green, which is farmers who have adopted them quite recently. So this is a new trend in our world of increasing specialization in agriculture. We're seeing people coming back to bringing livestock back onto their crop farms and adopting some of these practices fairly recently. Next slide. Okay, that's just a snapshot of what we learned. There's a lot more information that we gathered from the survey, and I want to point you to our website, which has a broad summary of, across all respondents, but then we also divided the responses up by state. We looked at beginning farmers and versus experienced farmers, and then we also looked at this pool of responses in terms of ones that were integrated farms versus crops only farms versus livestock only. So all of that information is there for your use. Next slide. And in addition to the survey summaries, we also collected an additional information, and that is also there on that website. We have several infographics like those you see on the left that are just nice visual pictorial representations of some of the things that we learned, some of the take homes. And then we also did seven in-depth case studies of farmers in 5 states in the region. And these case studies are narratives of those farm stories, how they adapted to integrated systems, and why they adopted certain practices, and some of the details about their farms. So those are all there on the website as well. And one of the things we did with those farms is look at some financial information, and that was a prelude to what we're doing today. Next slide. So one of the take homes from the survey was that a lot of the farmers see benefits to integrating livestock into their systems from the production side of things. They did say they saw improved soil health, and they did see improved conservation outcomes, as Gabby was talking about before. We had more equivocal responses on some of the financial questions, like reduction of feed costs, only about 50%, and diversification of income streams, and reducing financial risk actually was relatively low. So that kind of sparked additional interest in kind of digging deeper into the financials of these systems. Next slide. So with the current study that we did, we had 2 basic questions that we wanted to answer by really doing a deep dive into the financials of these systems. One of them, as Gabby mentioned before, is, are there cost efficiencies gained in these systems? Can they save money in their cost of production by having an integrated system? And then the other question about, are there long-term benefits? Are there like financial resilience benefits to having a diversified system like this? So those are the questions we were hoping to ask with the study. Next slide. So what did we learn? A little bit of information about how we collected the information. We used the University of Minnesota FINPACK framework that you may be familiar with. It's a database of financial information collected from farmers across the Midwest. We used 2024 as the year for collecting the data, so it's a snapshot. We worked with 11 integrated crop and livestock farms across 4 states, Iowa, Minnesota, Missouri, and Wisconsin. And the average size of these farms was somewhat larger, almost 1,000 acres. You can see they're split between crops, hay, and pasture. And then to look at how these farms stack up against crops only farms, we went back to the FINPACK program, and they have a section called FinBin, which is a database that we can sort out farms of particular types, look at averages of income and costs for those farms. So we use the same states for this comparison and use the same size range of farms. And from the database, we found 610 farms. So we're comparing an average across these 610 farms to our 11 crop and livestock farms. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer to tell us what we learned.
Yeah, so some of the things we did when we compared the integrated crop and livestock farms to the crop only farms. So as we move through these tables, we're going to show you some of the financials that we came back with to compare. And all of them are going to look fairly similar to what you're seeing here. I do want you to keep in mind that these are on a per acre basis. And the crop only, obviously, all of their acre basis is going to be in crops. The crop and livestock farms, part of roughly 30% of their acres are going to be in crops. The other portion will be in hay and livestock, hay and pasture. So as we move through this, and we look at our income categories, our total crop returns for each farm looks quite a bit different, right? So they are on our crop only farms, we're looking at about $600 return on our crops, and on our integrated farms, roughly $150. Our livestock returns, our crop only farms don't have livestock, so it's zero. And then our crop and livestock integrated farms have, roughly that $540. We look at crop insurance, the crop only farms are much higher than our integrated farms on our crop insurance revenue. Hedging and other income. So the hedging and other income also include things like custom work or patronage, some livestock insurance, maybe some farm rental, things like that. You can see that our integrated farms have more additional revenues coming in beyond just crop or livestock. And then the government payments, we're looking at the crop payments, the conservation payments, and any other payments that these farms might be receiving. And so our crop farms are seeing a bit higher return on government payments and those crop payments. So looking at total gross income for these two farms, you can see we're only about $50 difference on a per acre basis between these two farms. So substantially they're different, but they're not significantly different, right? There's not a large difference in them. All right, next slide, please, Jane. So we're gonna look, we see that total income right here at the top, and then we've broken our expenses out into about 4 different expenses to try to tease out if there are efficiencies on these farms, and if so, where are they? So our total crop expenses, we can see that our integrated farms are roughly a third of what our crop only farms are. And again, we kind of expect that because roughly a third of our acres are being utilized for crops only. Where it becomes really interesting is that whole farm expense and overhead expenses. So the whole farm expense on the crops was higher. The overhead expenses on the livestock was higher. We look at total expenses on these farms, and we can see that our crop only farms have a higher total expense than our integrated farms do. And our net return is much lower on our crop only farms than it is on our integrated farms. We're going to dive into each of these categories a little more to try to tease out maybe what's different in these broader expense categories. Next slide, please. So when we start looking at our crop costs, we can see that our integrated farms spend a lot less money per acre on our crop costs. Again, that was kind of to be expected because we're looking at about a third of the acreage for crops only on these farms. But you can see a lot of these prices are at about that third level, and so we're really okay with that. It's different, but it's not to be unexpected. Next slide, please, Jane. When we look at the livestock costs, we don't have the livestock costs on the crop only farms, so it didn't show you a whole column of zeros here. But we can see we did have a couple farms that were buying feeder livestock and finished feeding on their farms. So we do have a pretty large expense there. But beyond that, purchase feed is the largest expense on our livestock farms. So we do see purchase feed generally as that largest expense. We can go ahead and go to the next slide, Jane. Here's where things start getting a little more interesting. So we pulled out the custom hire and hired labor because we really wanted to see, we know that our livestock farms, our integrated farms, I should say, they have labor more year-round than crop-only farms do. While we're dealing with crops in the spring, summer, fall, we really have a lot of labor that goes into livestock in the winter for winter feeding. And so this was something we really wanted to tease out here and kind of point out is that our integrated farms do typically hire more labor, at least the cases that we've looked at, they hired more labor than our crop-only farms did. Okay, next slide. And then when we get into that business expense category, here are some of the pieces we pulled out of that to really look at. And three things really jumped out at us at first: that land rent, the depreciation, and the interest. And, we got to really thinking about that land rent and decided that that makes sense. On our integrated farms, a lot of the land they were renting was pasture land or maybe hay land, and that comes with a lower per acre annual cost than cropland does. And so I think what we're seeing there in the land rent side is the difference between the per acre cost for pasture and the per acre cost for tillable cropland. So we didn't really get too worried about that one being different. But the depreciation and interest, that really shows how these farms are thinking differently. On the crop only farms, we're seeing a lot more depreciation, which means we've got some newer equipment happening there that still has depreciation ability on it. We're seeing higher interest, which means we've got a few more loans to the bank, and we're making those interest payments than we do on our integrated farms. And so I think that's some of the difference in thinking between these two types of farmers. All right, we can go to the next slide. And so back to this bottom line slide. We've already seen this one with our total income at the top. And really what I wanted to point out is that while we do have differences in our livestock expenses and our crop expenses, really what we're looking at and really trying to focus on is the efficiencies in these whole farm expenses and the overhead expenses. That's where we're really seeing the efficiencies come to life in these integrated farms. And so I kind of wanted to total these columns because, our whole farm expenses was 266 on the crops and our overhead 161. And it looks a little like it's reversed on the crop and livestock farms. But when we total those two boxes for each of these farm types, we can see that, we've got almost $100 in efficiencies that are happening. And so we're, to help us tease this out, we're going to look at some partial budgeting. So we can go to the next slide, please, Jane. So to answer our first question, are there efficiencies gained in these integrated systems that can save farmers money? Yes. Unequivocally, we can say yes, there are efficiencies. Were they in fertilizer and chemical costs? I don't really think so, not if we look at it on a per acre basis. If we look at it overall, we do have cost savings on those things, but I'm not sure if it was due to the efficiencies. But where the biggest efficiencies really came from was spreading those whole farm and overhead costs. And so the other part of the question that we were looking at was that long-term profitability. So what I just showed you was a 1-year snapshot of the financial information between our crop farms and our integrated farms, right? But any good person is going to look at me, any good farmer is going to look at me and say, well, crop prices were pretty low in 2024 and livestock prices were high in 2024, and that's what's causing all this. And so to help tease that out a little more, Jane is going to go through some partial budgeting and really look at a price sensitivity analysis to see how these farms do with comparing them over time. So I will turn it over to you, Jane.
Yep, thanks, Jennifer. So partial budget analysis is a technique that strips out all the things except the pieces that you want to look at. And so for this partial budget, we were using the 2024 data still, but only the cash income and direct expenses. So the partial budget is looking just at the crop and livestock enterprises on these farms. The direct expenses, the direct cash income, not things like depreciation or overhead. And so this is only including those things. And also this partial budget analysis is only including 7 of the 11 farms because the framework that we're using is really sensitive to starting out with acreages devoted to various crops, hay, pasture, and so forth. And we had solid data on that for 7 farms. And also it's not currently set up to deal with dairy. So the dairy farms in this analysis were kicked out. We'll be working on getting it competent for dairy, but right now it's not. So we're looking at 7 farms that are beef operations. So a partial budget is set up in quadrants. You've got a gains column and a losses column. And in the gains column, you've got the income you gain from the new enterprise. In this case, the new enterprise is considered to be the livestock portion, getting overlaid on a crop farm. And also on the gains column, you've got costs that you avoid because of the new enterprise. And then in the losses column, you have the direct costs of the new enterprise, the livestock in this case, and also income potentially you could have gained that is lost because you have that enterprise. Okay, so if we add up the gains column and the losses column, and the gains column is higher, then it looks like the addition of that enterprise is a net gain for the farm overall. And if it's the reverse, if the gains column is less than the losses column, then it looks like that enterprise is a loss to the farm overall. So for these 7 farms in this composite scenario, we've got a farm that looks like 137 acres of corn, 123 of soybeans, 90 acres of wheat, 170 acres of hay, some other crops in there, about 560 acres of pasture, and it's running 120 cow-calf pairs. And it's also it's selling primarily feeder calves, a few bred heifers, a few fed cattle, probably for direct marketing, and then selling some cull cows each year. And we're using the 2024 prices for commodity crops and feeder calves, bred heifers, and cull cows. So here are the livestock categories, the top half of that partial budget quadrant. For the livestock, added income from feeder calf sales and bred heifer sales and cull cow sales, that totaled up to $282,889. And then the livestock added costs, overall categories, about $125,000. And then the bottom half, those expenses saved or income not realized. So expenses saved, we've got less crop production cost because there are acres in hay and pasture instead of row crop. The value of manure as fertilizer and the value of soil retained, not lost to erosion on the perennial acreage that's not tilled. And then the crop income not realized includes grain and hay that's fed to animals instead of sold for cash. And the opportunity cost, those crop sales that you're not getting from tillable acres that are instead in perennial hay or pasture. So here's the bottom line on that. The gains column minus the costs column. We do see a net gain from livestock of $84,000. The crop enterprise on its own loses about $30,000. So a net gain overall between crop and livestock enterprises of about $52,700. So then we're going to go into that sensitivity analysis, the price sensitivity, and looking at how that shifts as crop prices and livestock prices shift. So here is the first panel of that sensitivity analysis. This is the crop and livestock enterprises added together. And that box in the center there is the $52,775. That was the net income from adding the 4 quadrants, the crop and the livestock enterprises. And this is the 2024 prices of $4.40 a bushel corn and $11 soybeans. but the historical long-term average price for corn and soybeans is $3.64 corn and $8.97 soybeans. And so the 2024 prices were a little bit higher than that. The red box shows the columns that kind of contain that historical long-term average. And then on the rows, the 0% represents the 2024 price, the average overall head of all classes of livestock when feeder calf prices are at $2.70 a pound. So looking at this, we can see that the livestock plus crop enterprise is profitable over a lot of this chart. It's obviously not profitable when both livestock and crop prices are low. But now we're going to go deeper into this partial budget idea and sensitivity analysis and look at the comparison of the farm with the livestock enterprise to the hypothetical of the farm if all of the tillable acres are tilled and planted to cash crops and there are no livestock on the farm. So how do those two stack up in comparison? And here, the purple area is the crop and livestock pricing conditions in which the net cash gains from livestock overcome the potential gains if all tillable acres are tilled and in cash crops. So purple is where a farm that has a livestock enterprise integrated into it is doing better than a farm that is just all cash grain. The cell circled in red here is a cell that we'll see on the next slide. That's where the farm with livestock is doing better than the farm without, but still unprofitable overall. So these numbers show how much better the livestock farm is than the case of all crops, but it doesn't always necessarily mean the farm is profitable. So here is that slide that shows where, under what conditions, the farm with livestock is losing more money than if everything was in cash crops. That's the bright red. The light red is where the farm with livestock is losing money, but it's losing less than if it was all cash crops. The light green is where the farm with livestock is making money, but making less than it would if everything was tilled up in cash crops. And bright green is where the farm with livestock is making money, and it's making more money than that case if it was all turned into cash crops. So what we can see here is that a couple things. When crop prices are low, when they dip to that historical long-term average or below it, the livestock tend to protect the farm finances overall, right? The livestock are the bright green areas where the livestock farm is doing better than the crops only farm. But there's also quite a bit of that light green in here where the farm is still profitable. It's maybe not making as much as it would if it was all tilled up, but it's still profitable. And that represents some space for the farm to do things that it may want to do, such as adding a livestock enterprise to bring on a next generation, for instance. There's profitability space to do that here. And you are giving up some potential income on the high end of crop prices, but you are protecting the farm on the low end of crop prices. And I'm going to turn it back over to Jennifer to talk more about that balance. And Jennifer, you are muted.
Of course I am.
There you go.
So again, we're addressing these two questions, right? Are there efficiencies and are there long-term profitability? We can go on to the next slide. And One of the other ways we looked at this was looking at our farm financial scorecard. So this covers 5 different categories of different ways to compare how the farm is doing financially. And again, we've got the crop only farms and we've got our integrated farms. And so on as we move through these 5 different financial categories, we're going to see that we're going to have the category, the names of the ratios below it, and then that middle column for every dollar. So for instance, on liquidity, if all your bills showed up tomorrow, do you have enough cash to cover them? And so for our current ratio, for every dollar of bills due, the crop only farms have $2.11 available to pay those bills. The integrated farms have $5.94 available to pay those bills. And so that's how this is going to work as we move through the next 5 slides. One of the things that I really like to show on here, though, is that working capital to operating expenses. So this is the cash operating expenses in a year. And so for every dollar spent on expenses, the crops only farm has about 62 cents in cash reserves, and the crop integrated farm has about 68 cents. So not a big difference between them, but I will note that all of these boxes are in green, and we can see that scale along the top right of your slides where we've got red as vulnerable, yellow as moderate, and green as strong. And so both of these farms have fairly strong liquidity. And I say farms, remember our crop only farms, that was our FINBEN data from 600 and something farms across those 3 states. And our integrated farms, that was 11 farms from our immediate study that we're looking at. Okay, next slide, Jane. So solvency. Solvency is if you sold everything today, how much would be left after paying the bank? Okay, so we're starting to see some moderate risk on our crop only farms, where our integrated farms are still in pretty good shape here. So our debt to assets, for every dollar of assets that these farms own, the crop farms owed 40 cents to the bank, roughly. The integrated farms, roughly 15 cents to the bank. So we're starting to see some differences here on exactly what we were talking about, that our crop farms have more machinery and more debt and more interest paid on their farms than our integrated farms did. Another way to look at these two, the first 2 rows here, the farm debt to asset and the farm equity to asset, is to say that, on our crop only farms, for every dollar of assets, they owe 38 cents to the bank and 62 cents is owned by the farmer, or 38% of their assets are owed to the bank and 62% is owned by the farmer, where our integrated farms were 14% to the bank and 86% to the farmer. Go ahead, Jane. When we look at profitability, you're seeing that we've still got some vulnerable areas across both types of farms that we looked at. So our rate of return on assets, for every $100 in assets the crop only farms had, they were actually losing about 40 cents. So, we weren't showing great profitability when compared to assets, to equity, or even to sales, as we move down the first 3 rows there. So we're not doing so great on those crop only farms. Again, we were looking at 2024. So remember, this is a 1-year snapshot. And we know that all of our farms, whether they're livestock farms, integrated farms, or crop farms, their income fluctuates as prices fluctuate over the long term. But in this scenario, we're seeing that our rate of return on assets for our integrated farms, for every dollar of assets they had, they were looking at about a $3.30 return. Another thing I really want to say about this profitability when we compare it to assets is that all of these farms are very asset heavy. And so when we divide by a really large number, we expect the outcome to be smaller, right? And what I mean by that is we've got land assets, we've got machinery assets, we've got a lot of assets tied up in farming. And so while these farms are vulnerable, it's a little bit to be expected. Next slide, please, Jane. Now we have the repayment capacity. So essentially, do you have enough leftover cash flow to cover what you promised to the bank each year? We're seeing a pretty significant difference between our integrated farms and our crop-only farms. You can see that by our crop-only farms being red here and our integrated farms being green. And so for every dollar of needed for payments to the bank, the crop-only farm only had about 70 cents available. So that means that they aren't able to cover their whole debt each year. And they're having to shift some things around. Our crop and livestock farms, they had about $6 available for every dollar needed to make payments. When we look at the long-term debt, so that long-term debt looks about the same. So really what we're seeing here is that our crop farms are more heavily financed than our integrated farms were. Next slide, please, Jane. And then financial efficiency. So for every single dollar that is earned on the farm, how many cents are swallowed up by costs, right? So how much do we owe to others? And we've got that operating expense, the dollar of sales to dollar expenses. So our crops, for every dollar that they brought in, they owed 84 cents in our operating expenses, 9 cents in depreciation, 7 cents in interest, leaving the net farm income of about 1 penny for every dollar of sales that they had. Our crop and livestock farms, our integrated farms, they owed about 69 cents to operating expenses, 2 cents to depreciation, 1 cent to interest, leaving them about 28 cents of every dollar as profit to their operations. All right, next slide, please, Jane. And so, again, are there long-term profitability benefits associated with diversified systems? You know, from what Jane has presented, from looking at their financials, their that snapshot of financials, you know, the integrated farms are doing a little better than the crop farms. But we kind of want to talk about one more piece. Next slide, please, Jane. So Gabby mentioned earlier about diversification being a risk-reducing tool in financial portfolios in our farms. Like we can use it in a lot of places to reduce risk. And there's one huge challenge of diversification on our farms that I see lots of farms, they really struggle with this. One enterprise on the farm, whether it's the crops or the livestock, is probably going to be less profitable than the other. You know, Jane's slides showed this. We're going to see that. One is going to be less profitable than the other, and that really provides a temptation to go back and specialize into just one thing. And so we really have to be careful of the trade-offs between the long-term risk-reducing efforts of diversity and the perceived short-term economic loss of one enterprise being less profitable. And so the big question becomes, you know, do we look at the short run or the long run? Do we look at short-term profit or long-term farm viability? And only the farmers individually can answer that. One more slide, Jane. Just to bring that back around just a little bit, you know, Jane showed us these two big pieces. And really the top one, that is that short run analysis, right? So what happens if the farm adds livestock? Does it make more money than the crops do? And you can see a lot of that is negative. The answer to that was unequivocally no, unless we had high prices on the livestock and low prices on the crops. But when we look at that long run analysis and really seeing that risk reduction of how the livestock plays out. So the crop farms were less profitable when they had livestock and high crop prices, but they weren't losing the farm when the crop prices were low, right? So there's that balance that we're trying to achieve here. Okay, and I believe, Jane, it is back to you.
Yep, thanks, Jennifer. So we do have an evaluation survey that we would love to have everybody on this webinar. Please fill out because, you know, we have to do grant reporting. So there's the QR code and the Z link for that survey. It's short, I promise. So if you could all click into that now and fill it out as we're wrapping up with our conclusions here over the next several minutes. And Gabby or someone, if you wouldn't mind throwing that Z link into the chat for people that missed it before I move on to the next slide. And oop, here we go. Over to you, Laura.
So, what did we learn from this 4 or so years of work? Some of our conclusions include that these integrated crop and livestock farms are quite complex and they vary a lot from farm to farm. Each one had a different structure. And that may present some challenges definitely in operations. Income per acre has been typically higher than for the crops only farms. And the cost of production is significantly higher on a per acre basis, but that was the income was enough higher to wipe out that difference. We ended up with a income per acre, as you recall, the crops farms were $7 per acre, and the integrated farms were $128 per acre. And we found, looking at these financial benchmarks, that the integrated farms looked like they were more financially resilient and more stable over the long term because of the multiple income streams that they had. But we also found, especially in the original survey work, there are some challenges for farms, for crops only farms that have been specializing maybe for a generation or more. If they're thinking about integrating those livestock back into their operation, there are some challenges like finding markets, fencing, housing, labor, all of those things. So on the next slide, this is just another question that we asked the farmers on the survey. And the interesting thing we found was when we asked a whole series of potential challenges that farmers might see with these integrated systems. You'll see the green bars are the farms who had livestock, had integrated systems, and the yellow bars are farmers that were crops only. And what you can see is that the perceptions of challenges were very different. And there were a number of issues that crops only farmers see as being an obstacle to integrating livestock into their systems, that the livestock farmers, found they were still challenging, but not insurmountable challenges. So this is the area where we feel that we as educators across these states can work with producers who are expressing interest in moving on from the first 4 soil health principles and adding those livestock back into their system. Here's where we can help them bridge that gap and make some potential changes in their systems. Okay, next slide.
All right. Thank you, everybody, so much for joining us today. If you have any questions, we'd be happy to answer those now. And again, the Greenlands Blue Waters website, Match Made in Heaven, Livestock and Crops, that has all of the original Match Made in Heaven project stuff on it. And we will be adding this recording and slide deck there if you want to find it later. So May Petrain has a hand up.
Yeah, hi. I work with a lot of integrated livestock farms in central Minnesota. I'm a NRCS partner with Ducks Unlimited, and I predominantly work with grazing. So folks that are doing a lot of this crop and livestock integration. Just a couple questions to kind of clarify some points. I heard a comment about the 1-year snapshot, and that was just for the sensitivity analysis. And I think what I just was hoping for clarification on, so like when we're talking about the benefits of, say, grazing livestock, getting the manure on the ground, potentially reducing fertility inputs, do you guys feel like you allowed for enough years in your analyses to really account for that advantage? Because especially like with beef manure, you're not going to get that nitrogen credit, for example, right away, year one or even year two. That's really kind of a cumulative benefit over time. So just was curious about some perspectives on that. And then I know this combined data from a lot of states, and I'm just curious, um, maybe just some thoughts or some comments on, like, at least for central and southern Minnesota, I don't work with producers almost at all that have over 500 acres of pasture. If they do have livestock, they're fighting each other tooth and nail for pasture access. Um, so it's a little hard for me to take some of this data to livestock producers in at least central and southern Minnesota to even compare anything apples to apples with how much pasture acreage was included, if that makes sense. So just curious about some thoughts on those things.
I can take a stab at that, and then others can jump in as well. On your first question, I think that's the main limitation that we learned as we went through the financial data from our first case study farmers, and then with these 11 farmers, is that there are those cumulative impacts that we just really aren't able to capture financially. So that was just a limitation of the study, and I'd love to see somebody do a longer term study to see if we can tease that out a little bit more. And then your other question about pasture availability, and that I don't know that we have a good answer to that. I can turn it over to others for their responses, but
I'm going to blame Missouri for skewing the data on that potentially.
No, it wasn't Missouri. It wasn't
Yeah,
Missouri.
actually, there was
I
a
don't know what
Minnesota
state
farm
has
that had
all
a
this pasture,
big.
but it ain't.
But I think that,
Minnesota.
yeah, I will say that one of the reasons why we did this work was because there are a lot of options for getting livestock out onto cropland that we're not taking advantage of, and with crop residues and cover crop grazing and more complex crop rotations that include annual forages. So I think there are ways of addressing that, even if you're in an area that doesn't have plentiful pastures. Like that's where I'm in southern Wisconsin. Cropland here rents for $300 an acre and costs $10,000 an acre. So to justify grazing that, you really need to have your pencil sharpened. So, but there are a lot of
Well, and
ways of.
that's kind of the nature of my question too, is like if I'm looking for some financials to show to the producers I work with as an example of, maybe a crop dominated operation that everyone wants to expand their livestock operation right now, right? Like that's all the folks I'm working with. They're buying cattle, they're keeping heifers, everybody's in expansion mode, but they don't have the pasture. So they're very, acutely aware and trying annual forages and diversifying their rotation, but to be able to arm them with a little more data about the big picture financial impacts of that is kind of was my hope. But when I go to them and I say, well, here's some examples, but these operations have 500 acres of pasture, it's just I don't know, that's just something I'm trying to navigate in my head.
And I really think that's a really hard thing to do anyways, because while 2024 and 2025 livestock look fantastic, right? We've
Right.
amazing livestock prices. But we know the cattle cycle runs in 8 to 10 year cycles, and we're going to have downturns. It's not always going to be amazing. And one of the one of the best ways that I've gotten to talking to my farmers about this is really that we're operating in two different buckets that operate in two different markets to reduce our risk. And, probably the worst time we're going to have is when the cattle prices are so-so and the crop prices are so-so and neither farms are really making a lot of money, right? But anytime we have the swings and the cattle prices go up or the crop prices go up, these farms do better because they operate in two different markets with two different market timings, and the prices don't affect the sales of their stuff. Obviously, when crop prices are high, it costs more to feed livestock. And so when I go out and do economic talks to my livestock people or to my crop people, I'm either making one happy or the other, right? I can never make both people happy at the same time. And that's
Right.
why this makes it such a great tool for risk reduction. Because they can be happy more often if they're playing in both markets. That's oversimplified.
I like that. I like that phrase. Happy more often.
Happy more often, right? Or less loss, less often.
There you go.
That doesn't work out as well, but you get it.
Sure. Yep. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll maybe just jump in and address the snapshot in time. So we did use 2024 data with the farmers in this phase of the study. And, the partial budget and the numbers that Jennifer showed were all based on that 2024 data. The partial budget shows, those shifts in crop prices and livestock prices. So those happen over time, over years. And we did also do similar analysis with farms from the previous Match Made in Heaven study. That was 2022 data when corn prices were $6 a bushel and soybean prices were over $12 a bushel. And so, so that just kind of shows how much things can change on the crop side in just a few years. And also, obviously, the livestock side, because 2024 prices at $2.70 a pound for feeder calves in the 500 to 600 pound range, that's way higher now. So that's the point of those sensitivity analysis, to show how it shifts, based on changes in price, because those are not static at all.
You're
Let's see.
muted, Jamie.
Any other questions folks have? We're at 1:01, so we brought it home in an hour. But if anybody else has burning questions you want to raise right now, we could entertain them. Otherwise, thanks everybody for joining us, and have a lovely rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.